Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Diego Lopez, and today we're going to discuss the correlation between the Asperger syndrome and polyglossia. To that end, we have a very special guest, my dear friend and fellow hyperpolyglot, Saverio. Saverio, how are you?
I'm very, very good. Thank you. Very, very well. I'm very, very grateful to you, Carlos, and to everyone in the Hyperpolyglot community for granting me this opportunity to open a door for the Asperger syndrome affected people into the polyglot community.
Sure, it's our pleasure. And so this is how I came to this topic. I remember when I attended my first polyglot conference in 2018 in Slovenia. I witnessed Alexander Argueda's presentation on the character traits of polyglots and hyperpolyglots. And there he basically argued that and showed statistically that polyglots have a greater than chance probability of being male, gay, left-handed, on the autistic spectrum, and having some autoimmune disorders such as asthma or allergies. And he showed the statistics to back that up based on a poll that he had conducted himself. And apropos Asperger, he said that Asperger syndrome is a condition that takes place in 0.5% of the global population. But in the case of the polyglot community, 6.1% of that community has the Asperger condition. So that's 12 times higher than in society in general. And for high functioning autism, this takes place in 0.25% of the global population, but it's represented in 2.5% of the polyglot community. Now, it's interesting because the percentage of people with Asperger syndrome in the polyglot community grows as we analyze people who speak more and more languages. So people with Asperger syndrome are more overrepresented amongst polyglots that speak 10 or more languages, for instance, than amongst polyglots who speak, say, 5 or 6. However, with high functioning autism, it happens the opposite. It is more prevailing amongst polyglots that speak 5 to 6 languages than it is amongst polyglots that speak more than 10 languages. But in both cases, there's a strong correlation between having that Asperger syndrome or being a high-functioning autist and being a polyglot. And so I wanted to ask you from a first-person perspective, as someone who has been diagnosed as having Asperger condition, what is Asperger? How is it different from a Savant? What are we talking about exactly?
Well, first of all, let me emphasize that according to DSM-5, which is the catalog of mental illnesses and psychological conditions published by the American Psychological Association, Asperger syndrome has disappeared as of 2013 to be englobed and incorporated into the autism spectrum disorder. So from a more general perspective, you could say that I'm affected by autism because people don't nowadays distinguish between high functioning autism, Asperger, and general autism, which I think it is a mistake, because people affected with general autism, let's say, are in much more grave conditions that than we are, than we who are diagnosed with high functioning autism or Asperger's are diagnosed. For example, I've met people with autism, general autism disorder, who couldn't really utter words, so they couldn't speak aside from a few repetitive syllables. So I think it is a mistake to label people with Asperger's or high functioning autism as belonging to the same spectrum. And as I have studied, because I'm not that proficient in that which comes to the Savant syndrome, like the one Daniel Tammet has. But as I have studied, savants are people who have the capacity to memorize huge amounts of information, but who also are doted on selective mutism or selective memory. So they approach learning, and they approach social interactions in a very, very special way, and in a very, very strange way, so to say. So the difference between us is, I would say, we Aspergers have the capacity to communicate. We have a higher rate, a higher vocabulary rate on different subjects than our normal counterparts, let's say, between inverted commas, because nowadays no one is normal, so to say.
Right.
And we just need a functional kind of stimulation, which people fail to provide. Many people, many teachers, and many students who are working.
What does that mean, Saverio, that you need to have a functional approach to language?
Functional approach to language means that we have to be involved in learning the practical aspects of language before learning the pragmatical aspects. For example, someone with Asperger's might be more capacitated to learn languages verbally if you stimulate him or her, than to learn the grammatical rules and the pragmatical rules of expression. Because Aspergers tend to have a higher memory level than many other people. Right. So if you give them lists of words to memorize and situations in which they can express those words, you will be doing them a wider favor than if you put them to learn like what's a direct object, what's an indirect object.
Yeah, that makes sense, because when we speak about certain people in the autistic spectrum who have a passion for languages and are obsessed with languages and have the ability to memorize a lot of words and linguistic components, we also speak of them as having some sort of social skills impairment. And language is a social activity. So how do we reconcile both? Yes, on the autistic spectrum can, in some cases, if that happens to be your obsession, like language or like verbal autism, as they are called sometimes, help you with the structuralist aspect of language. But at the same time, language is also social activity. So if you're handicapped in that sense, then the end result, is it really better? Is it really a better language learner at the end of the day?
I think the point is on focus, because as you said, language is a social activity, but we Aspergers often have social impairments and lack a significant amount of social abilities. But if one has the obsession to learn languages and to become proficient in the language, social inability can, in a sense, evaporate, because when you learn a language and when you focus yourself and are obsessed about the language, you tend to surmount all barriers posed by your inability. So in a sense, I have a very hard time interacting with people who don't share my interests. But when I start learning a language, I totally concentrate on making myself a part of the culture which comes with the language. So my aim is to become totally absorbed by the language and the culture, so as to become a part of the culture. And when I aim to become absorbed by them, I have to put aside my social impairment, because in order to learn a language and to become absorbed by it, I have to deal with many, many social issues, and I have to talk to people who maybe don't share my concerns, or maybe they don't share my interests, but they are a means to arrive at completing my cycle of learning a language. So I would say that the result is qualitatively better if you learn to integrate your social impairment into the aim, the objective that you yourself mark when starting to learn.
Very interesting. And
because one clear aspect that I would like to emphasize here is that when you are obsessed with something as an Asperger related person, you have to dissociate your obsession from your social impairment. So to say, you are a totally different person when you are working on your obsession than when you are away from a keyboard or away from a screen or away from the books.
So when you are practicing your target languages, you are much more of a social person than when you're not.
Yeah, like for example, when I am away from a keyboard or away from a screen, I'm totally shy. I hesitate in talking to people. I have a very great difficulty, like when striking friendships and creating bonds of friendship. But when I'm working on my languages, or when I'm reading in my languages or writing in my languages, I become. It is as if I had a second skin, like snakes. I like to compare myself to a snake when I'm learning languages or walking the languages. My job as a translator enables me to do it like fairly daily, because I have to work with a very, very wide range of languages. So in every language I speak or I practice, I put on a different skin depending on who am I working to, what am I working to.
Very interesting. And what about your personal experience connecting with the polyglot / hyperpolyglot community? For instance, we have HYPIA, the International Association of Hyperpolyglots. They're all the members are hyperpolyglots. So how is your interaction with them, with people who are hyperpolyglots, as opposed to your interaction with people who are polyglots?
I would say that it's far easier, because people who are hyperpolyglots share a lot of my concerns and my interests, and as they have a broader point of view than normal polyglots do, it's easier for me to communicate with them and to engage in discussions with them. I was reading yesterday an article by Dr. Griswold from a university in the United States, saying that multilingualism may be a boon for people with Asperger's. And I'm glad to say that in my case, it was so, because it has always been a boon, because thanks to multilingualism and thanks to hyperpolyglossia, I became inducted into the International Association for Hyperpolyglots, and I found a circle of friends with whom I interact far more easily and far more wantingly than I do with normal people, not just normal people, but also polyglots. Because I think that normal polyglots also have a very raising ego, you know, so as to say, if I know more than 3 languages, I think that I'm like a god. I think that I'm like Air Jordan or something like that.
The Dunning-Kruger effect, right?
Yeah, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Mm-hmm.
But when you arrive into the hyperpolyglot community, you realize that you are one amongst equals, you know, unus inter pares, you know, unus inter pares, because there's no importance given as to whether you know 6 languages or 7 languages or 8 languages. All of us are equal there, and I like this sense of equality better than the competition that forms itself amongst the members of the polyglot community.
Mm-hmm. And is it also the case that you have encountered more people with Asperger's syndrome amongst hyperpolyglots than amongst polyglots?
Yes, it's the case. For example, I can name 3 people in Hypia who are Asperger's. They told it to me. Like we have Esteban Fortunato, which is the expert in Romance, an expert in Romance languages from Brazil.
Uh-huh.
We have Sebastián Alarcón.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Okay. I already knew before entering the International Association of Hyperpolyglots, and we have Matthias.
I didn't know that either. Right. Yeah, and they are very, very active. I mean, Matthias is
they are very active. They ought to be considered as ambassadors of hyperpolyglotism.
Yeah, definitely. They do a really, really good job at promoting hyperpolyglossia. And any difficulties that you have encountered with polyglots or hyperpolyglots, times where you haven't felt as accepted, and how did you react? How did you turn that around to improve that situation?
I have already told that story to you once, but last year I was making a series of videos for my YouTube channel, and I got a suggestion from a couple of friends of mine saying, why don't you post a video explaining how did you learn Italian in 4 days during your first trip to Italy? So I set myself to the task. I recorded the video, I uploaded it, and within an hour or so of uploading it, I became the target of insults, of derision tactics, because they said, "Oh, this man is making fun of Benny Lewis and his method, and this man believes that because he lives in Europe, he has access to all these languages, and it is far easier for Europeans to learn languages, and you haven't given us any proof. You haven't added to the recording a minute or so of you talking in Italian for these 4 days of the trip." And then I must say that I overreacted a little at first, and I uploaded a second video without having a prepared script. But afterwards, I got many messages of reassurance from from the people in the Hyperpolyglot Association, and I realized that there is an American saying that applies wonderfully to that occasion: "You cannot be everybody's darling." So I incorporated that into my life, and I never ever again participated in a debate about multilingualism amongst the polyglot community, because there is a saying in Ladino, I don't know if you know it: "El que se echa con criaturas se levanta pisado."
Hey.
And I realized that people in the polyglot community were generally applying to that. Saying.
All right, and just last question. I'm sure a large part of the audience that is listening to this and watching the video are familiar with Daniel Tammet, the savant that famously learned Icelandic in 1 week, memorized a lot of decimals of the number pi, etc. What is your take on that? Do you know his story, and what do you think about his linguistic abilities?
Yes, I do know his story, because he was given an interview, and he gave an interview, and I believe it was Finnish television, and I watched it when it came on air.
You mean the Icelandic television or the Finnish television?
I believe it was both.
Okay.
I believe he gave both interviews. I'm not sure. I would have to check it. But I watched that. I watched that interview when it came on air, and I think people like us, people with Aspergers, and people with other ranges of autistic disorder must be recognizing to Daniel Tammet, because thanks to Daniel Tammet, the doors were open to us. Because before Daniel Tammet arrived, no one knew whether people with special capabilities could fit into the scheme of language learners. So I think Daniel Tammet opened the door for us and gave us a squeeze during the time which he devoted to learn as many languages as he did. So I'm very, very thankful to I'm very, very thankful to him for having cleared a lot of the clouds which were surrounding the myths about Asperger's syndrome and autism.
Speaking of which, do you have any sources that you would recommend for people who want to get an introductory reading, want to get their foot in the realm of high-functioning autism and Asperger's?
Yes, there is a novel which I always use to make people conscious about about what Asperger's entails, which is called Marcelo en el Mundo Real by Francis X. Stork, which is about a 17-year-old American guy with Asperger's who is passionate about music and horses. And there is also a British novel called The Curious Incident of the Dog at Midnight by Mark Haddon. And reading about it and reading those two books could give people an insight about what Asperger's is all about. Because many people whom I have met during my lifetime, since I got diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at age 9, have just talked that Asperger means that I have a mental disorder, and that I am mentally retarded. So not even when I learned the number of languages that I speak nowadays could I convince them that I wasn't mentally retarded. But I think that reading those two books can add to the comprehension of Asperger's in the neurotypic world.
Very useful. So I'll make sure to link all of these sources in the description of this video, as well as your own YouTube channel for people to learn more about your own content. And Saverio, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Also for me.